Okay, so here we're going to talk about how to find the domain of a function. The most important thing you should realize about domain means what you can actually plug in for x so that the function makes sense in the real world, in the real number world, I should say. So a lot of times when you're looking for domain, it's best to see what you can't plug in for x. And there's two things in math that you cannot do. You cannot divide by zero, and you cannot take the even root of a negative number. Square root is an even root. Fourth root is an even root. What's not an even root is cube root, for example. So this square root is understood to be 2. So you only have to worry about dividing by zero and taking the even root of a negative number. Otherwise, you don't have to worry. So, first example, if I had just asked you what's the domain of this function, stop there. So you have to think, is there any value of x that would make you divide by zero? Well, first of all, there's no division in this. So the answer is no. Second thing, would any value of x force you to take an even root of a negative number? Well, there's no radicals in here. There's no roots. So there's nothing to limit what x is here. You're not dividing, and you're not taking an even root. So the domain for this is all real numbers. In other words, x can be anything, and you'll get a real answer. So x can be 3, you just plug it in. X can be 0, you get 7. X can be negative 58.6. So that's an example of where domain's not an issue. Let's look at this one. Let's say f of x equals 5x plus 7 divided by x squared minus 3x plus 2. All right, so now we want to figure out the domain of this. Two things you can't do: divide by zero, even root, and negative. Well, there's no radicals, so don't worry about this as far as radicals go, but you cannot divide by zero. So this is a division problem. You cannot divide by x squared minus 3x plus 2 if that equals 0. So your goal here is to figure out, where does x squared minus 3x plus 2 equal 0? Because I want to avoid that. You can't divide by 0. So now you just solve. This is a factorable quadratic. Factors of 2 that add up to negative 3 are negative 2 and negative 1. So this quadratic equals 0 when x equals 2 and x equals 1. Therefore, if x equals 2 or 1, you would be dividing by 0. That's illegal. You can't do it. Therefore, x equals 2 and x equals 1 cannot be part of the domain. So the domain for this is all real numbers. You don't usually have to write all real numbers. You can just write the exclusions, but I'm going to put all real numbers, but except for x cannot be 1 or x cannot be 2. Now, if you do a quick check, just if you plug in 1 for x, you'd get 5 plus 7, which is 12, divided by 1 minus 3 plus 2, negative 2 plus 2 is 0. You would get 12 divided by 0, which you can't do. So 1 should not be included in the domain, and I did eliminate it. Same thing with 2. So basically, when you have a fraction, figure out what would make the bottom 0, and just state that that can't happen. So those, in this case, 2 values of x are not part of the domain. Finally, I'm going to give you this one. F of x equals 3x squared plus 4x minus the square root of 7 minus x. Strange looking function, but let's think about it. If you're looking for the domain, there's no division, so you don't have to worry about dividing by 0, but there is an even root. There's a square root. You cannot take the square root of a negative number. That means whatever is in here, inside the square root, which is 7 minus x, must be positive, or it could be 0, because you can take the square root of 0. So therefore, you want to figure out, well, when is this positive or 0? So I'm going to write a little mini equation here, 7 minus x. To be able to take the square root of it, that must be greater than 0, positive, or equal to 0. So greater than or equal to 0. This will give me my domain. This tells me what x can be. I think the easiest way to do this problem is, see that minus x? Just add x to both sides. So I'm going to add x, and then just kind of rewrite this. That means x is less than or equal to 7. So the domain of this, for it to work, is x must be less than or equal to 7. Easy to check. Pick a number that's less than or equal to 7 and make sure it works. Say 0. If I plug in 0 here, that's fine. The square root of 7 is the square root of 7. So that should be part of the domain. Now pick a number that's outside of the domain and make sure something goes wrong. So a number that's not less than or equal to 7 is, say, 10. So if I try to plug 10 in here, I don't care what happens here, but I would get the square root of 7 minus 10, which is negative 3, which can't be. So 10 should not be part of my domain, which according to this, it isn't, because 10 isn't less than 7. So that's maybe more explanation than you want, but that's how you find domain. If you have a fraction, make sure you're not dividing by 0. And if you have a even root, make sure whatever in that root is positive or 0. In other words, greater than or equal to 0.